Yeah, thanks, Jacob. And yeah, in terms of this topic, what is fascism then and now? It's basically a topic to look at and understand fascism in order to fight it, because what we've seen around the world is a drastic, alarming growth in the normalisation of far-right and fascist ideas in so many places. Like, I couldn't even, if I sat here and list them all, I'd be here for a long time. But you have seen a situation where the type of politics we thought was, consigned to the, or a lot of people thought was consigned to the garbage bin of history has well and truly made an extraordinary comeback, particularly in a circumstance where you've had the massive financial crisis in 2008, the fallout from that, and the continuing crisis of the system around the world. So just to mention a few examples, Giorgia Meloni in Italy is the Prime Minister. She's a member of a fascist organisation, a committed member of a fascist organisation. The contender, the second main contender for the presidency in France is Marine Le Pen, whose father established the National Front, the party that she's part of, and has renamed to the National Rally, explicitly on the model of Mussolini and the Nazis. You've got, Trump in the United States, who's been so willing to fan the flames of the far right, mobilise them at certain times, like on January 6th, and, give extraordinary amounts of oxygen to these types of political forces. You've had recently the big wave of racist rampages and attacks on mosques and stuff like that in the UK. So yeah, a lot of people see these developments and think it's horrific and think it's something that does have to be stopped. But in order to actually do that, we have to understand what specifically we do mean by fascism and where it fits into these constellation of other far-right forces which have been growing out of the crisis of capitalism. So in this talk, I wanted to do a couple of things, and it'll be, pretty brief in sort of trying to cover everything. But I think one thing I wanted to do was just look at the lessons very briefly of the rise of the Nazis in Germany as one way to sort of understand the political DNA of some of these movements we're seeing now, but also to deal with the question of how do you actually define fascism, and to put forward basically a Marxist analysis of that, which draws on the classic writing of Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky, who was writing about the rise of Mussolini and then the Nazis in Germany in a very perceptive way, where if his advice about what to do in response had been taken, the sort of rise of the Nazis in the 20th century could have been stopped. And I think the reason to look at that definition of what actually is fascism, it's particularly important because there's a lot of sort of confusing, different, conflicting commentaries about fascism in the mainstream at the moment. Like, on the one hand, you'll have it thrown around just as a word that's used to label people the political establishment don't like for various reasons. So the BBC, for example, will run articles uncritically repeating Zelensky calling Vladimir Putin a fascist, but then will run articles on actual fascists like Marine Le Pen being like, is Marine Le Pen far right? Let's discuss. So you have this sort of this confusing commentary on the one hand, but also around the US election, the mobilisation of the idea that Trump is a fascist, will destroy democracy, and therefore everyone has to shut up and line up behind Kamala Harris, and that sort of dynamic as well. In terms of navigating through that, I think the Marxist analysis of fascism is very important. So yeah, in terms of the talk, I wanted to start with what we say the key features of fascism, and flowing from that, some general points about how to fight it, look briefly at Germany, and then come back to some of the contemporary far-right and fascist forces and categorise where they fit into this picture based on our analysis. So, in terms of the Marxist analysis of fascism and defining it, I think one of the key things Trotsky offers is that in characterising fascism, it's not just a matter of going through a list into authoritarian, racist, homophobic, and just ticking boxes on a list. Like, to understand the essence of the movement that emerged in the 20th century and whose most dangerous features we're sort of seeing re-emerge in some places now. His starting point is that the whole fascist movement, the key role it plays within capitalism is to be the most vicious, extreme kind of battering ram against the organisations of the working class, like trade unions, political parties, that would exist under a normal sort of liberal capitalist regime, and that the historic role of fascism is to annihilate those organisations and remove them from society in order to, pave the way for a capitalist revival. So fascism as a movement has that as an objective of tearing out those organisations root and branch. And you can see it with the rise of the Nazis. They smash the trade unions, throw everyone into concentration camps, smash up all the left-wing parties. They replace the trade unions with the Nazi Labour Front organisations, and then go on to smash every bit of normal civil society organisation you'd see in a liberal democracy, from smashing up, making the sports clubs Nazi to making the, marching bands Nazi, like every little pocket of society. And it's particularly able to do that because, as I'll go on to talk about, it is a genuine mass movement. It's not just a conspiracy of a few people at the top funding Nazi thugs. It's got serious roots in society, and that's what makes it so dangerous. So, in other words, you can have political parties or political figures that are racist, bigoted, anti-working class, that don't actually have that smashing of liberal democracy and the working class organisations as their political objective. I think the other thing that defines the Nazis, as I just mentioned, is the mass nature of the movement. We have to appreciate that. It is a genuine mass movement when it emerges in its fully fledged form. So if you look at the Nazis, in 1929, their membership rose to 175,000. In the period of the Great Depression, by 1931, their membership is 800,000 and 225,000 paramilitary forces in the stormtroopers. So you have, on average, 890 people a day joining the Nazi Party in those couple of years. So that's the mass character of the movement. The third thing I wanted to mention was the means they used to reach their objectives, because like the Nazis or other fascists, they do run in elections, they use the media to propagate their message, they hold rallies, they have meetings, all the things that normal political organisations would do. But the thing that distinguishes them is also forging a weapon to carry out their actual goals in the form of that paramilitary force like the Nazis had with the stormtroopers, that can physically smash the working class organisations, that can terrorise the minorities, that can make their political objectives a fact on the ground. And that's very important to understand in terms of combating the fascist movement, understanding what it is, understanding when a political formation is or isn't fascist, or when it's moving in that direction. So, there's the stereotypes of like, oh, Hitler was a hypnotic speaker, he spellbound all these people in Germany and made them fascist. But really what characterised the Nazis wasn't speeches, it was that they could back up what they were saying with by 1933, 400,000 stormtroopers. So it's with these characteristics that Trotsky calls the fascists a razor in the hands of the class enemy. And what makes this fascist movement so dangerous is not just what they can do on their own terms in terms of attacking the working class organisations and minorities and institutions of liberal democracy, but it's actually the service they can offer the ruling class and the elite of capitalist society, where in a situation where the system is in serious crisis, those ruling forces, people who own the big companies, the people who run the big companies, the people at the heights of the state, the generals, and so on, who really call the shots under capitalism, when they're backed into a corner, fascism can offer them an out, and it can do things they couldn't do on their own terms. So this is really what you see in Germany. Hitler never won or was elected by the majority of Germans. He was made chancellor by the politicians and army chiefs of the political establishment in Germany in 1933. And this was in a circumstance of the Great Depression, 42% unemployment, 42% collapse in industrial production, 30% of the workforce unemployed, millions upon millions of people. And in this situation, Germany, who's been a loser in World War I, who's constrained by the Treaty of Versailles under the Weimar Republic, if the ruling class of that country wants to restart capitalism by rearming, going to war, capturing markets, raw materials and workforce from other countries in Europe and so on, they have to do it over the top of the Weimar Republic. They have to smash that up. And underneath that is the trade unions, the Social Democratic Party, the left, the Communist Party, that political order really rests on. So in that circumstance, where the German army is constrained to 100,000 people, what the Nazis can offer with their forces, their mass influence, their 400,000 stormtroopers is very, very serious in terms of giving the option to change the trajectory of German capitalism and get out of this unprofitable situation. So this is why Trotsky writes, the historic function of fascism is to smash the working class, destroy its organisations, stifle political liberties, when the capitalists find themselves unable to govern and dominate with the help of democratic machinery. So in certain times they can profit and run the system with democracy, but in other times they can't. So he says, at the moment the normal police and military resources of the bourgeois dictatorship, he means capitalism, together with their parliamentary screens, no longer suffice to hold society in a state of equilibrium. The turn of the fascist regime arrives. So they provide that massive force, they provide that battering ram. The next thing I wanted to move on to was the other key aspect of Trotsky's analysis, which is basically a class analysis of fascism, which can explain why it can take on at certain points this extraordinary character of a mass movement, where its sort of political program stems from, and what gives it the ability to offer itself to the ruling class and come to power. So his analysis is quite unique in this sense, in that he says the social base of fascism is the middle class. And by that he means, he calls it the petty bourgeoisie, but he means like small farmers, shop owners, landlords living off rent, professionals, managers, that strata of capitalist society. You've got the big capitalists at the top, the people at the top of the state, you've got the millions of workers who they exploit at the bottom, but that's not all you have. You have this middle strata of people. And you can see the over-representation of these groups in analysis of the Nazi Party or other fascist parties, but he talks about it in these terms. He says, through the fascist agency, capitalism sets in motion masses of the crazed petty bourgeoisie, he means middle class, bands of declassed and demoralised lumpen proletariat, he means unemployed, all the countless human beings who finance capital has itself brought to desperation and frenzy. So what he's talking about is a particular effect of a massive crisis on that middle strata of people. Obviously, like, workers are going to be smashed by a 42% drop in production, 30% unemployment. They're going to be unemployed, desperate, in deprived conditions, but it's also going to mean mass layoffs for the more elite sections of the white-collar workers. It's going to mean the little business people, their markets get destroyed by the fact no one's got money, and by the fact the big businesses are dropping their prices and driving them out of business because of the crisis. So he says, in that circumstance, this middle strata of people is what he uses the word crazed, because not only are they pushed potentially into complete destitution, they're pushed in a circumstance where they define themselves by their superiority to the working class. They've applied themselves, they think, work harder. They've been rewarded for their superiority to the rest of the working class, and now they face unjustly being deprived of their privileges and being shoved back amongst their inferiors. So he talks about that as sort of driving this frenzy amongst the middle class. And like Hitler appeals to this in Mein Kampf, he says, for people of modest situation who have once risen above that social level, it is unendurable to fall back into it, even momentarily. And, you know, people like small employers are less able to absorb the demands of workers for wage rises and things through their unions. So there's an organic sort of working class, anti-union politics that prevails amongst this strata. And the other aspect to this is that workers have organisations to fight back collectively, trade unions to fight the layoffs, mass organisations they can use to try and fight for better welfare and improve their conditions. The middle classes don't have those weapons like strikes. A bunch of self-employed people can't respond to the crisis by striking against themselves. They're trapped in this situation, and fascism offers them, you know, a brutal solution to that circumstance. And you can see the Nazi Party platform and other iterations of fascism specifically pitch bits of their platform and their solution to these classes. So the Nazis talk about abolishing interest, government warehouses available for low rent to small businesses and all these sort of things, more government positions for all the people who are getting thrown on the scrap heap if the Nazis take over the state. The worthy can rise through the ranks of a massive state bureaucracy. So yeah, that's an important aspect of what can drive fascism as a mass movement. It means the base is middle class. It doesn't mean only middle class people are in fascist organisations, but their politics drives it. It also doesn't mean the middle class is automatically fascist. Like, the reason fascists need organisation is to capture those people in an active way. So if you look at the Weimar Republic, the first election that happens, 10% of the votes for the German Social Democratic Party, the Labour Party, actually come from the middle class. You can even see in Australia, you know, with Whitlam or whatever, there's a massive sort of shift of middle class votes to them. But yeah, these vacillating sort of middle classes can be drawn behind a decisive working class solution to a crisis, a progressive solution. The fascism isn't, the attraction of fascism isn't inevitable, but the weakness of the left in the face of a crisis can also leave a vacuum to the fascists. All right, I'm gonna have to compress this. But some of the key things that flow from that analysis about fighting fascism, one is a particular approach we have to fascists, that we support no platforming fascists. We support denying them all the forums that would be open to normal political organisations, because their goal isn't to talk, it's to build a force that can physically destroy liberal democracy, minorities, working class organisations. So we do support shutting down their meetings, if it's possible, confronting and shutting down their street marches. Just a quick point on the street marches, because fascists are bringing together a class of people who normally, as middle class, they're competing against each other, little business people, different managers and so on. the physical act of the street marches is very, very important to them, because it gives this class of people a particularly intoxicating sense of unity. It makes worms feel like dragons, is how Trotsky puts it. So actually physically making it impossible for those marches to happen is very, very important. And you saw even some good glimpses of that with the recent attacks on minorities and these street attacks in the UK, where once that started happening, in some places there was gargantuan counter-mobilisations where you end up with this little pitiful handful of fascists looking around like, oh my God, there is like 30,000 people and we're being protected by the police. So that has a profound effect on this type of organisation, because it makes the worms feel like, you know, the worms that they are. Also, there's an incredible importance on confronting their ideas, because fascists will latch on to, you know, the general racism pushed by the mainstream, blaming migrants for housing and job losses, the transphobia, the Islamophobia. So actually mass confronting those ideas also is incredibly important in denying them oxygen. I'll just have to wrap up in the next 5 minutes, so good luck to me with that. But I think the key lesson from Germany is, though, you can say that we need to do those three things, like deplatform them, confront them en masse in the streets and so on, but it is critical who's actually doing that. Is it a tiny minority of the working class, or is it the whole working class? Under the influence of Stalinism, the Communist Party in Germany during the rise of the fascists, it was a big party. It had like 170,000 members or something, more than that. But they had an explicit policy that said the Labour Party, the Social Democratic Party, is just as bad as the fascists. The unions that they run are just as bad as the fascists. So they left the unions, abandoned the majority of the working class to the influence of leaders who were not going to confront fascism in the way I've just gone over. They actually joined up with the fascists at certain points and, for example, sat in at delegates' meetings by SPD unions like the waterfront unions and disrupted their meetings alongside fascists, instead of being in that meeting passing a resolution of why we need to confront the fascists on the streets. And this meant, as the fascists rose, like when they started assassinating people in 1931, the Communist Party tries to call a general strike and 180 people turn up. Like, they're completely, catastrophically isolated. So Trotsky's prescription for this is the United Front, putting forward those strategies and tactics of how to fight the far right and how to fight fascists to the whole working class, and appealing to the leaders of the Labour Party, Social Democrats, their unions, in order to win over their base to that action. And yeah, just to finish up, I'll return to the fascists today, because there are sort of classic fascist organisations that have sprung up, like Golden Dawn in Greece, models itself on the Nazis, had the street thugs, assassinated people, beat the shit out of migrants, broad daylight in the middle of the street, attacked trade unionists. But that party was broken by exactly the strategy Trotsky put forward when they assassinated anti-fascist rapper in 2013. 600,000 people joined a general strike against the Nazis, and there were smaller micro examples of that all across the country. The organisation was broken, marginalised, its leaders were jailed. There's also sort of organisations called Euro-fascists, like Le Pen in France or Meloni in Italy, where they've, in terms of their public pitch, they've abandoned the Nazi imagery. They tried to distance themselves from the street thugs. They wear suits. They try and claim to be respectable. They run on a platform of extreme racism against migrants and stuff like that. But these Euro-fascist parties, it's important to understand, they're different to just general populist right-wing parties like UKIP, because the people at the heart of them are fascists, and they have an understanding of the fascist project and what you need to pursue it. So while they're using elections in a particular way and have shifted to a more moderate footing. At the same time, they maintain vestiges of classic sort of fascist organisations. So the National Rally in France, Le Pen's party, it still maintains a security service, they call it, called the DPS, of like 1,500 people. That's full of former military, former police, thugs, that they use as security for their events to protect their leaders, supposedly, and stuff like this. But they see these organisations as the nucleus of what could become, in other circumstances, a much more serious street movement. But again, I think the recent situation in France showed their growth is not inevitable. Like after the first round of elections, there was 800,000 on the streets of France, and it punched a big dent into the fascist success at the following elections. So it showed that a lot of the support they appeal to is really mainstream racism and disillusionment with the political establishment, and that can be confronted and it can be pushed back. And I think similarly, like Trump, the populist right-wing racists, they don't have that explicit fascist project, but they do encourage fascists, give them the oxygen they need to breathe, grow the swamp they need to expand, and as we saw with Trump in January 6th, are even willing to mobilise those kind of forces at certain points. So there's a fluidity in that which we shouldn't be complacent about, even though you wouldn't say they are pursuing an explicitly fascist project. Obviously, whether or not those forces are fascist, they need to be confronted in the way you started to see with Le Pen in France and fought. But in order to understand how to defeat actual fascist movements, we do need to look at the particular strategy and tactics that Trotsky put forward. So yeah, definitely run out of time, so I'll just leave it there, and yeah, there'll be plenty to go over in discussion.